Howdy everyone, and today I'm taking a look at a camera lens that a lot of people have requested me to review. I have the Samyang 14mm f2.8, a very popular ultra-wide-angle lens for full-frame or APS-C cameras. Actually, for a change, and to see what they're like, I've decided to test out the cine version of this lens. Samyang makes cine versions of pretty much all their lenses with the same optics, but slightly different build quality, which is optimized for video makers. Technically, this is actually their 14mm T3.1 cine lens, the T number representing the precise light transmission. But like I say, the optics are exactly the same as the classic 14mm f2.8 lens. 14mm is a crazy wide angle when you're shooting on a full-frame camera, giving you a dramatic perspective and very stretched corners, and pushing away your subject. And even on an APS-C camera, 14mm is a very wide angle indeed, although it's nothing like as dramatic a perspective as you get on a full-frame camera. And this lens's wide maximum aperture of f2.8 means it can let in a decent amount of light for getting pictures in darker situations. Canon and Nikon already offer 14mm f2.8 lenses, which cost well over £1,000 each. However, this Samyang lens, astonishingly, is only £250, or about $300 US. That makes it potentially amazing value for money. It is a manual focus lens, but when you're shooting ultra-wide angles, that doesn't really matter too much. It's easy to manually focus such a wide-angle lens. Let's look at its build quality. The lens is small and quite solid, feeling quite firmly made, and as I mentioned, it's a completely manual lens with no electronics inside. As this is the cine lens I'm looking at, the focus ring turns an extremely long way for knife-edge precision during focusing. It turns extremely smoothly too. If you're just doing normal photography with this cine lens, then you'll find yourself turning and turning that focus ring. It's also geared on the outside for if you're using a focusing rig. The manual aperture ring on this lens also turns extremely smoothly. On the normal, non-cine lens, it clicks across the aperture range. But with the cine lens, it works smoothly so that you can change the aperture like this. To a lot of video makers, this is the only way you can really softly change your light levels while shooting, so it's a useful feature. The aperture ring doesn't travel very far as you turn it though. It's certainly nowhere near as precise as the focus ring. The lens comes with a handy lens hood which clicks into place positively. On the whole, the build quality is excellent if you don't mind manual focus, and it's well featured for video makers. Still photographers though will prefer to work with the normal version of this lens with its quicker focus ring and clicked aperture control. Let's look at image quality. First off, on a full-frame camera, a 20 megapixel Canon 6D. Remember, we are testing a camera lens here which costs a quarter of the price of Canon and Nikon's equivalent equipment. In the middle of the picture, we see a very sharp image indeed with reasonably good contrast. The colours seem to show a very slight green tint, which would be easy to correct in editing. Let's look into the corners. They're a bit dark due to vignetting, but astonishingly, they're also very sharp indeed. That's a big surprise for an ultra-wide-angle lens on a full-frame camera. It's sharp from corner to corner, straight from f2.8, which makes it a little bit sharper than Canon and Nikon's lenses. Also, there is no evidence of chromatic aberration. Very impressive. Stop the lens down to f4 for more brightness and even more contrast and sharpness, and from f5.6, the image quality is completely perfect from corner to corner. Well, for such an inexpensive lens, this is a truly amazing optical performance. The Samyang 14mm f2.8 is a triumph in sharpness. Let's take a look at the performance on an APS-C camera, in this case my trusty old Canon 6D with its 18 megapixel sensor. And it's more or less the same story. Straight from f2.8, the lens is very sharp in the middle of the image and just as good in the corners too. There's also no visible chromatic aberration. an impressive feat for a lens at work on an APS-C camera. Stop down to f4 for even more sharpness and contrast, and the lens basically remains this sharp now throughout the aperture range. So, on an APS-C camera, the lens performs almost flawlessly. If I were to nitpick, I'd say that it could show a little more contrast, but again, you can always add more in editing if you need to. It's an excellent performance overall. Well now, let's take a look at distortion and vignetting. On a full-frame camera, unfortunately, the lens shows a very heavy amount of barrel distortion, bulging out in the middle. You can also see it on an APS-C camera. At f2.8, there are also some extremely dark corners, but to be fair, that is completely normal for this kind of lens. Stop down to f4 for brighter corners and f5.6 for good illumination, although you'll always have to deal with a spot of darkness right in the edges. So vignetting and distortion seem to be this lens's Achilles heel. The minimum focus distance of this lens is only 28 cm, so it certainly will not be confused with a macro lens. Close-up picture quality, however, is very sharp straight from f2.8, so at least there's no problem with what you can get. Let's see how the lens works against bright lights. There is very little loss of contrast when bright lights are in the picture, although we do get some flaring patterns sneaking into your image when the sun pokes its nose in. When it comes to the quality of this lens's bokeh, well, this is the most out of focus background you can really get, to be honest. At least those out of focus backgrounds do look reasonably smooth. Well, overall, Samyang play a bit of a game of optical strengths and weaknesses with this lens. It may have problems with distortion and vignetting, but at the end of the day, you'll be working with an optic that is so ridiculously sharp, and not to mention amazing value for money, that you probably won't mind too much ironing those problems out using editing software. As I said before, manually focusing is not really a problem when you're working with such wide angles, and so I'm happy to recommend this lens to any wide-angle enthusiast.